For 9 endless days, a lone fisherman drifted across the open Pacific on a half-destroyed wooden skiff, surrounded by nothing but blue water, blistering sun, and silence so deep it felt alive. His name was Elias Rowe, a seasoned fisherman who had weathered storms before, but nothing like this. After a sudden squall ripped apart his boat and swept him far from any shipping routes, Elias found himself stranded with no fresh water, no supplies, and almost no hope. As dehydration clawed at his mind and the salt burned his cracked skin, he was forced to do the unthinkable just to keep himself alive. He began eating jellyfish and sea snails, tearing them straight from the ocean with trembling hands. Every moment became a desperate calculation: how to ration his strength, how to avoid drifting further into nothingness, how to keep his sanity when the horizon refused to change. This is the story of how one man faced hunger, loneliness, and a sea that wanted to swallow him whole, and chose to fight anyway. Before diving into this unbelievable true story of survival, take a second to comment where in the world you're watching from, your city and country. It really helps us connect this global community of people who love gripping survival stories. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next unbelievable tale of endurance, courage, and raw human instinct. Your support keeps stories like this alive, and trust me, this one will stay with you long after it ends. The ocean is beautiful from afar, but up close and alone, it becomes something entirely different. In Elias's case, the sea transformed into both captor and provider. With the sun beating down on him like a hammer of fire, and the nights turning so cold his teeth wouldn't stop chattering, he learned quickly that survival wasn't about strength, it was about adaptation. The fish he once caught for a living were now nowhere to be found. Birds avoided his drifting wreck. Even the current seemed intent on pulling him further from help. In those first hours, Elias held on to the fading belief that rescue might come. But as the sun rose and fell in a merciless cycle, hope became something he had to protect as fiercely as his body. By the 3rd day adrift, Elias's body was already collapsing under dehydration. His muscles cramped, his vision blurred, and his lips split open like dried earth. The ocean taunted him, an infinite expanse of water he couldn't drink. His tongue felt like sandpaper, and whenever he swallowed, it was like dragging a blade down his throat. In these moments of weakening resolve, the first jellyfish drifted near the hull, its translucent form pulsing gently in the water. To anyone else, it would be something to fear, something to avoid. To Elias, it looked like a chance. A horrible, slimy, almost unthinkable chance. But a chance nonetheless. He didn't know it yet, but this first desperate bite would become the only reason he lived long enough to be found. Once he crossed that mental threshold, once he realized he would eat whatever the ocean offered, something shifted inside Elias. Survival stripped away pride, comfort, and fear. It awakened an ancient instinct buried deep within every human being. He stopped thinking about meals and started thinking about calories. He stopped wishing for a rescue and started scanning for movement. Jellyfish, sea snails, drifting scraps of kelp, anything soft enough to chew and salty enough to stave off death, became food. Every sunrise brought new uncertainty, and every night brought whispers of hallucination. Yet Elias kept going. Because even in the middle of a silent blue desert, surrounded by nothing and no one, he believed that if he kept breathing, kept fighting, kept swallowing whatever he could find, he might live to see land again. Long before the ocean turned against him, Elias Rowe was known along the northern coast as a calm, dependable fisherman, a man who understood tides the way others understood clocks. He had grown up on the water, learning early how the ocean could cradle or crush without warning. On the morning his boat vanished beneath the waves, he left the harbor thinking only about the day's catch, the weathered nets stacked in the hull, and the familiar rhythm of tide and wind. There was nothing extraordinary about that morning, no omen, no sign of what was coming. But as every survivor eventually learns, Disaster rarely announces itself. One moment Elias was steering through a curtain of mist, and the next he was staring at a wall of black clouds rolling across the horizon with impossible speed. Before he could radio a warning or adjust his course, the storm seized him. The peaceful sea he knew so well transformed into a violent monster intent on swallowing him whole. The storm's fury came in layers. Winds that screamed like something alive, waves that slammed the hull with bone-shattering force, lightning so close it turned the world white. Elias fought it with everything he knew, cutting the engine to ride the swells, adjusting his weight, tying down what loose gear he could reach. But nature wasn't just against him, it was determined to break him. A rogue wave rose higher than the deck and crashed down with the weight of a falling building. The boat shattered, the world inverted. And suddenly Elias was no longer a fisherman fighting a storm. He was a man alone in the ocean, struggling to keep his head above water as the remains of his boat drifted away in pieces. Every instinct screamed at him to keep swimming, to grab anything still floating, to fight the cold that wrapped around him like chains. When the storm finally passed, what remained was a brutal stillness. The ocean, moments ago a raging beast, now lay flat and blue as if nothing had happened. It was in that quiet, floating among splintered wood and torn rope, that Elias first understood the truth. He wasn't just lost. He was beyond rescue routes, beyond radio range, and beyond anyone's expectation of survival. He found a broken section of his skiff's hull, still buoyant enough to hold his weight, and climbed aboard. His palms were bleeding, his ribs ached from the impact, and his throat burned with the early signs of dehydration. But the shock of survival kept him focused. He told himself someone would come looking. He told himself boats had drifted before and been found. But even then, doubt whispered. The ocean was too big. He was too small. As the hours stretched into the first full day, Elias began to feel the shift from crisis to endurance. The sun beat down on him relentlessly, stripping moisture from his body and scorching his skin. His lips swelled, his tongue thickened, and each breath tasted of salt. He had no drinking water, no food, no shade, only a floating shell of wood barely wide enough to lie on. The sea offered no mercy. He saw no seabirds, no ships, no movement except for the slow, hypnotic roll of waves. Hope started to thin under the pressure of reality. But Elias forced himself to stay alert. He monitored the currents, studied the sky, searched the water for anything edible or useful. Days would pass before he understood how crucial that vigilance was. Because out here survival belonged not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. By the time the second day closed in, Elias realized the ocean would not feed him, not in the ways he was used to. No fish approached the floating wreck. No drifting debris offered supplies. His hunger deepened into something primal, gnawing and cruel. His thoughts began to blur, but in that haze, something drifted close, a translucent shimmer just beneath the surface. A jellyfish. Then another, and another. It was the ocean's first offering, strange and almost ghost-like. For a moment, Elias hesitated. Jellyfish were something he usually avoided with wide swings of a net. But now, as survival pressed against him from all sides, he felt his instincts rewrite themselves. If the sea would not give him fish, then it would give him this. And so, without knowing it, Elias crossed the first boundary between ordinary life and raw human endurance. It was a crossing that would define the next 9 days, and ultimately, his survival. When dawn rose on Elias Rowe's first full day adrift, it did not bring relief. The sky brightened slowly, washing the horizon in pale gold. But its beauty felt cruel. Indifferent to the man clinging to a battered slab of hull wood, drenched in salt, shivering despite the warm air. Elias lifted his head weakly, his neck stiff from a night spent braced against the constant sway of his improvised raft. Every muscle in his body felt bruised. His hands, torn open by the wreck and the storm, had dried with salt crystals embedded in the wounds. The moment he flexed his fingers, pain radiated up his arms like electrical sparks. But pain meant he was alive. On the open ocean, survival began with acknowledging even the smallest victories. He reminded himself of this often. Elias scanned the horizon the way fishermen did, trained, methodical, with instinct sharpened by years of experience. He searched for shapes that didn't belong to the sea, the edge of a hull, a buoy, a mast, a shadow moving against the grain of waves. But there was nothing. Only water stretching endlessly in every direction, a shimmering blue desert beneath an empty sky. The realization that he was utterly alone pressed on him with a weight he had never known. As a fisherman, solitude had always been a companion, a condition of the job, but this was different. This was isolation with teeth, isolation that hunted. He shifted carefully on the wooden wreckage, which groaned under his weight. It wasn't meant to support a grown man for long, but it was all he had. Its narrow surface forced him to lie awkwardly across it, half in the water most of the time, his legs dangling and drifting with the current. The salt water had swollen his clothes and left his skin raw, but taking them off would expose him even more to the burning sun. So he kept them on, soaked and heavy, forcing himself to believe they still offered some protection. The first real threat he faced that morning was dehydration. His lips had cracked during the night, and his tongue felt like sandpaper. He knew the rule better than most, 3 days without fresh water. But that was the average. Under relentless sun, surrounded by salt, dehydrating faster with every breath, he might not even last 2. Elias caught himself glancing at the water below him, not with temptation, but with grim awareness. The ocean offered everything except what the human body needed most. His stomach growled, but hunger was still manageable. Hunger could be ignored, postponed, outlasted. Thirst could not. He needed shade. He needed moisture. He needed anything at all that would help him hold on. Elias reached for the only tool he had, his mind. He forced himself to breathe slowly, lowering his heart rate, trying to conserve energy. Panic burned fuel. Control preserved it. He repeated simple instructions in his head. Stay still, stay calm, stay conscious, turning them into a rhythm that matched the rocking of the waves. As the sun climbed high, its heat became a living presence. Sweat evaporated instantly from his skin. His breathing grew shallow, his eyes squinting against the glare. He had no hat, no cloth he could drape over himself, no way to shield his face. Hours passed like this, melting together until he wasn't sure whether he had drifted farther offshore or whether the sea itself had swallowed the world around him. The loneliness felt almost physical, like a hand pressing against his chest. It was midday when he spotted movement in the water below him. At first he thought it was a shadow from a passing cloud, but there were no clouds. Then he saw it again, a shape drifting just beneath the surface, pale and soft, like a ghost. A jellyfish. Elias blinked, studying it carefully through sun-blurred vision. The creature pulsed with slow, delicate motion, its tentacles trailing behind it like translucent ribbons. Not far behind it floated another. And then another. A small swarm drifted near the broken wood, carried by the same current that held him captive. For a long moment, Elias simply watched them. He had never imagined a day when he would look at a jellyfish and see anything but a nuisance, a hazard, or something to avoid with a wide circle of his boat. But now, after nearly 24 hours without food, he saw something else entirely. Possibility. He thought back to stories he had heard over the years, tales of survivors who ate insects, tree bark, seaweed, fish eyes, or whatever else they could find. He knew that some jellyfish were edible in emergencies, though the species varied. But hunger made the decision simple. The only rule that mattered now was survival. Elias waited for the nearest jellyfish to drift close, then plunged his hand into the water. Pain shot through his palm as salt water hit the open wounds, but he closed his fingers around the slippery creature anyway. Its body squished in his grip like a handful of cold gelatin. He lifted it carefully out of the water, letting the tentacles hang away from his skin. His heart pounded. His stomach clenched, his mind rebelled instinctively. He whispered to himself, "It's food, it's food." Saying it aloud made it real. He brought the jellyfish closer to his face, studying its pulsing flesh. It smelled like nothing. It looked like a lump of translucent muscle. A strange calm settled over him. Something primal, sharp-edged, the kind of mental quiet that comes when choice is removed entirely. He leaned forward and took a bite. The texture was indescribable, chewy, wet, rubbery. A burst of salt filled his mouth. His throat convulsed, rejecting it. He almost spat it out. But survival overrode revulsion. Elias forced himself to swallow. The jellyfish slid down his throat like a lump of cold slime, and he gagged hard, coughing until tears formed in his eyes. But once the initial shock faded, something surprising happened. The hunger eased slightly. Not much, but enough to matter. He ate the rest slowly, carefully avoiding the tentacles. When he finished, he let his head fall back, breathing heavily. The energy boost was minimal, barely noticeable, but psychologically it was enormous. He had taken action. He had refused to die quietly. As the afternoon stretched on, he caught another jellyfish, then a third. His body reacted each time with the same mixture of disgust and desperate acceptance. But he swallowed them anyway, focusing on the simple fact that they were keeping him alive, one slimy piece at a time. Near sunset, something new drifted close. A cluster of small sea snails clinging to a bit of floating debris. Elias stared at them in disbelief. He remembered seeing similar snails in tidal pools along the shore years ago, tiny and edible if boiled or roasted. But out here, raw would have to do. He pried one off the driftwood and cracked the shell open with a sharp splinter from his raft. The snail inside was soft and dark, smelling faintly of brine. He hesitated only a second before tipping it into his mouth. The taste was strong, earthy, oceanic, metallic, but it was food. Real food, not just gelatinous mass. He ate all of them, licking the salt from his fingers afterward, even though it burned the cuts on his skin. That evening, as the sky turned pink and violet, Elias felt something he hadn't felt since the storm. Faint, cautious hope. It wasn't the bright, warm hope of rescue or safety. It was the hard, gritty hope of endurance, the knowledge that he could make it through another day if he kept adapting. By the time darkness returned, Elias lay stretched across his floating plank, his stomach less empty, his mind slightly clearer, and his determination stronger. The ocean hadn't beaten him, not yet. And as he stared at the stars emerging above him, he whispered a promise into the windless night. "I'm not done, not today." The second morning at sea began not with light, but with heat. An invisible weight that settled over Elias Rowe long before the sun even crested the horizon. He woke to the sensation of his skin burning, as if his body were lying beneath a giant magnifying glass. Every inch of him felt cooked, tight, and tender, like parchment stretched too far. His lips had swollen during the night, splitting at the corners. When he raised a hand to touch them, the simple pressure sent a sting through his jaw. He hissed quietly, his breath rattling in his throat. He blinked and forced his eyes open. The sunrise was a thin line of fire, stretching across the ocean like a blade slicing the world in half. Elias squinted against the brightness, shading his eyes with a trembling hand. Even the soft morning light felt harsh. The sun had become an adversary, a relentless force that sucked the moisture from his body and left nothing but salt and pain behind. Today, he knew, would be harder than yesterday. His raft, just a battered plank from the shattered Esther May, had dried overnight, causing the wood to warp slightly. It creaked beneath him, protesting each shift of weight. Elias adjusted his position carefully, trying to minimize the parts of his body exposed to direct light. But there was no real shelter, no shadow, no escape. He considered briefly the idea of slipping into the water to cool his skin, but he dismissed it immediately. The ocean was too unpredictable. Drifting beneath the surface would drain what little energy he had left, and the constant motion would wear down his already exhausted muscles. He had to stay on the raft, even if the sun scorched him alive. He swallowed, and pain surged through his throat. The dryness was unbearable, worse than hunger. His tongue felt thick as though it were swelling. Every breath tasted like salt. Elias knew he needed fresh water soon, but he also knew that miracles on the open sea did not come on demand. Rain, if it came at all, would come unpredictably. He muttered a quiet prayer. Not eloquent, not poetic, but desperate and honest. "Lord, even a few drops, anything." The ocean offered no reply. Hours passed slowly, each minute dragging like an anchor through sand. Elias tried to distract himself by scanning the water for food. Jellyfish still drifted nearby, their transparent bells rising and falling like living lanterns. He managed to catch one, though his grip was weak and slippery. The creature slid from his hand twice before he finally secured it, lifting it carefully by the bell to avoid its stinging tendrils. He bit into it with far less hesitation than the day before. Survival had a way of stripping away old instincts and replacing them with colder, simpler rules. Still, the jellyfish did little to relieve the deeper problem: dehydration. Each swallow of salty, rubbery flesh seemed to make his thirst worse. But he kept eating because hunger could not be allowed to regain strength. By mid-morning, Elias noticed something new. The water around him was alive with tiny flecks, small fish, glimmering silver beneath the surface. Anchovies, most likely, or another species that traveled in dense schools. They darted and flashed in rhythmic patterns like a shifting mosaic. Elias watched them hungrily, wishing he had even a simple net or a hook. But all he had were his hands. He waited until a cluster drifted close to the edge of the raft. With a sudden movement, one fueled by desperation rather than strength, he plunged both hands into the water and swept them together. Water splashed, cold against his burning skin. The fish scattered instantly, too fast, too agile. Elias cursed under his breath. He tried again and again, but each attempt was met with the same frustrating result: quicksilver vanishing between his fingers. Finally, one brushed against his palm, stunned for a fraction of a second by the swirling water. Elias closed his hand around it instinctively, his heart leaping with a spark of hope. He lifted it out of the ocean, the tiny creature wriggling in his grasp. Without hesitation, he bit into it whole, swallowing it quickly before it could slip free. The taste was sharp, metallic, but it was real nourishment, dense, rich, alive. It gave him enough strength to continue. As the sun climbed higher, the heat reached a level that felt almost supernatural. Elias's clothes dried stiff with salt, scratching against his skin like sandpaper. His eyes burned from the glare, and he found himself blinking rapidly, trying to keep them moist. His body temperature rose dangerously. He began to sweat, but the sweat evaporated instantly, offering no relief. The back of his neck felt as though someone were pressing a hot iron against it. He tried to splash seawater over himself, cupping it in his hands and letting it run down his arms and shoulders. The initial coolness soothed him briefly, but soon the salt dried and left his skin tighter, more painful than before. He repeated the process anyway, knowing it might be the only thing preventing heatstroke. By afternoon, Elias was drifting in and out of alertness. His thoughts grew foggy, like he was watching his own suffering through a thick sheet of glass. He wasn't sure if his breathing had changed or if the world around him had simply become quieter. He lay flat on the raft, his cheek pressed against the rough wood. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, slow and heavy. He needed shade. He needed water. He needed something, anything that would let him last until nightfall. It was during one of his half-conscious dazes that he noticed a change in the sky, a thin line of grey on the horizon. At first he thought he was imagining it, but as he squinted through the heat haze, the truth became clearer. Clouds. Real clouds. Not many, and not dark enough to promise a storm, but enough to cast faint patches of shadow across the ocean. Elias forced himself upright, clinging to the edge of the raft as dizziness washed over him. The clouds crept slowly, carried by winds he couldn't feel. Hours later, hours that felt like entire days, one of the shadows finally reached him. A temporary reprieve, but a reprieve nonetheless. He lifted his face toward it, breathing shakily. His skin, burning for so long, felt a brief coolness. It was like stepping from fire into open air. Elias closed his eyes and whispered another prayer, this one not for water, but for endurance. Just let me make it to tomorrow. The shadow did not last long, but it bought him time. He resumed scanning the water for food and spotted another cluster of sea snails drifting nearby on a floating branch. With effort, he reached out and snagged the debris, pulling it close enough to harvest the small creatures clinging to its underside. Their shells scraped his fingers, but he pried them free one by one. He cracked them open with a piece of wood, eating every bit he could. The snails tasted stronger today, almost bitter. But he forced them down, knowing his strength depended on these tiny, unlikely gifts. Late in the afternoon, the ocean shifted. A long, rolling swell lifted the raft higher than usual, then dropped it gently. Elias tensed, gripping the plank. Swells could be harmless, or they could be the first signs of a distant storm. He searched the horizon for dark clouds, but saw none. The motion continued, rhythmic and steady, like the sea inhaling and exhaling. It lulled him into a strange state of awareness, part exhaustion, part instinct. He found himself watching the water with a sharper eye, sensing patterns in the movement. He realized he was drifting into a different current, a stronger one. The sun was beginning its descent, casting the world in gold and orange. He knew night would bring new dangers, cold, darkness, disorientation, possibly predators, but it also meant relief from the sun. The thought alone gave him strength. As the last rays of sunlight touched the water, Elias slipped one foot into the sea, letting the coolness seep into him slowly. He kept his body balanced carefully, avoiding sudden movements. The water soothed some of the burning in his skin, though it sparked pain where the salt hit open sores. Still, he welcomed the sensation. When night finally fell, the temperature dropped quickly. Elias shivered uncontrollably as the heat left his body. He curled into himself, hugging his arms close to preserve warmth. The stars overhead seemed unimaginably bright, cold, distant pinpricks of light scattered across an endless black sky. He whispered again to the silence. Tomorrow. I just need tomorrow. The ocean rocked him gently as if acknowledging his plea. The day had tried to break him, but he had endured. Barely, but endurance was what mattered now. Elias closed his eyes, clinging to the drifting wood beneath him, and surrendered to another fragile, uncertain night. Night pressed down on Elias Rowe like a living thing. The darkness was absolute, thick, suffocating, almost sentient. As the sun vanished beyond the horizon, all color drained from the world, leaving only black water stretching endlessly in every direction. Elias clung to the remains of his raft, his fingers stiff and aching, the cold sinking deep into his bones. He felt as though the ocean were trying to pull the warmth out of him, one breath at a time. He knew from his years as a fisherman that nights at sea could be far harsher than days. The sun burned, but the cold crippled. Heat could take a man slowly, but hypothermia snatched him without mercy. Already, his teeth were chattering uncontrollably. Each involuntary tremor sent a spike of pain through his stiff muscles. The salt water soaked into every fiber of his clothes, turning them into icy layers that clung to him like wet cement. He pulled his knees toward his chest, tucking his arms around them to conserve the little warmth he had left. The raft rocked beneath him, the gentle rise and fall deceptively peaceful. Elias knew better than to trust the calm. At night, the ocean was a world of predators. Sharks, squid, unknown creatures rising from the depths. He forced himself to stay alert, fighting the exhaustion clouding his thoughts. The stars twinkled overhead, cold and distant. They were beautiful, but they offered no warmth, no comfort. Only a reminder of how small and fragile one man was beneath the vastness of creation. Hours passed slowly. Elias drifted in and out of awareness, unsure whether he was awake or slipping into dangerous micro-dreams born from fatigue and hunger. At one point, he heard something. Soft, rhythmic splashes, far too deliberate to be waves. His heart hammered. He lifted his head slowly, squinting into the black water. At first he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved. A long, gliding shape broke the surface several meters away, its dorsal fin slicing the water like a dark blade. A shark. Not just passing, it was circling him. Elias froze, barely daring to breathe. His legs dangled close to the waterline. If the shark lunged, he would have no chance of pulling them up in time. He pressed himself tighter against the raft, making himself as still and small as possible. The shark circled again, closer this time. Its body moved with a terrifying grace, effortlessly cutting through the deep. Elias watched the shadow vanish beneath him. His throat tightened. Was it directly under the raft? Minutes stretched into eternities. Elias gripped the wood until his knuckles turned pale, waiting for the sudden jolt of teeth, waiting to be pulled under. But the moment didn't come. Instead, the shark resurfaced on the opposite side, moving away slowly as though losing interest. Elias let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, but his relief was short-lived. A new sound broke the silence, this time a dull thud against the raft. Elias stiffened. The water rippled strangely near the plank, as though something large had brushed against it. He leaned forward cautiously. A massive shadow rose from below, lifting the raft slightly. Another shark? No, a whale. A humpback, judging by the shape, enormous, gentle, but still capable of capsizing him with a single movement. Elias held completely still as the giant moved beneath him like a rolling hill. For a moment he felt the raft lift higher, carried by the whale's broad back. Then slowly, the immense creature descended again, the water settling as though nothing had happened. Elias let out a cold, shaky laugh. Of all nights, of all things, he whispered. The ocean had a way of reminding him how powerless he truly was. The temperature continued to drop. Elias's fingers grew numb, the feeling disappearing one knuckle at a time. He rubbed his hands together, but the friction did nothing. His breathing began to shorten, not from fear, but from the creeping cold tightening around his ribs like a vice. He needed warmth. He needed movement. If he let himself stay still, he would die before the sun rose. Summoning what little strength he had left, he dipped his hands into the water and began splashing it over the wooden plank. He was trying to create friction, anything to keep the blood flowing. The icy water stung like needles, but pain was good. Pain meant he was still alive. The waves picked up slightly as midnight approached. Not a storm, just enough wind to create choppy movement. Each splash sent salt water spraying across his face. He tasted iron and salt on his lips. At one point the current turned him around, spinning the raft slowly in the dark. Elias lost all sense of direction. The stars rotated above him, dizzying in their slow spiral. He clung to the plank to keep from slipping off. Then he heard it. A hollow blump sound not far away. Another one followed. Air bubbles, but not small ones, large. A whale again? No, these were too rhythmically spaced. Then he heard a faint growl. Low, deep, guttural. His blood ran colder than the wind. Whatever made that sound was not beneath the water, it was above it. Elias whipped his head toward the noise. At first he saw nothing, only darkness, but then something breached the surface several meters away. A sea lion. A massive male. Sea lions weren't predators to humans, but they could be territorial, aggressive, and dangerously unpredictable. The creature lifted its head, snorting loudly. Elias held perfectly still, praying the animal would lose interest. It didn't. Instead, it moved closer, the water swirling around its powerful body. Elias tried to make himself look bigger, something he'd learned from dealing with aggressive dogs in the fishing docks. He raised his arms slowly and exhaled loudly. The sea lion stopped, watched him, snorted again. Then, after a tense minute, it turned away, diving beneath the waves. Elias slumped forward weakly, overwhelmed by exhaustion. Every encounter tonight felt like a test, one he barely passed each time. The hours after that blurred. At one point he hallucinated. He was certain of it. He saw lights floating on the horizon, golden and warm, like lanterns from a fishing boat. He tried to call out, but only a rasp came out. He waved one arm desperately. The lights vanished. Either a distant ship that couldn't see him, or just another cruel illusion of the mind. The cold worsened. Elias's shivering slowed, a very bad sign. When the body stops shivering, it means it's losing the fight. He felt sleep tug at him like soft fingers pulling him downward. He thought of his daughter. He pictured her drawing pictures at the kitchen table, her crayons scattered like candy around her small hands. He pictured her smiling, asking when Daddy would bring home another story from the sea. He couldn't die out here. He couldn't leave her without a father. That thought alone kept him awake. He forced himself to sit upright, gripping the raft hard. Every muscle screamed, but he didn't stop. He fought the heaviness behind his eyes, the seductive whisper telling him to rest just for a moment. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another. Finally, the sky began to lighten. It started as a faint glow, barely visible. Then the first streaks of pale blue appeared, smudging the darkness away. Elias exhaled shakily. He had survived the worst night of his life, barely. But survival didn't require grace, it only required endurance. As the sun rose, warming the air by fractions, Elias closed his eyes. He whispered, voice cracked and fragile. "One more day. I just need one more day." And the sea for now let him have it. Morning arrived not with warmth, but with a thin veil of silver light stretching across the horizon. Elias' row blinked slowly as the sun climbed upward, its weak rays cutting through the mist that hovered over the ocean. His entire body felt as if it had been carved from stone during the night, stiff, rigid, and sore. Every movement was a negotiation between pain and necessity. But he was alive, and that alone meant today mattered. The sea had calmed considerably since the terrifying hours before sunrise. Small waves lapped softly against the edges of the raft, rocking it with a hypnotic rhythm. The gentleness of the morning almost fooled Elias into thinking the worst was behind him. But hunger, far more vicious than any predator, tightened its grip on him now. His stomach cramped, twisting painfully. He hadn't had a real meal since the day his boat sank. What he had eaten, tiny scraps of jellyfish, slivers of sea snails, whatever drifting organic matter he could catch, was barely enough to keep his body operational. He needed food, more than ever. But the sea did not bend itself to the desires of desperate men. He scanned the water, searching for any sign of life. Birds, floating debris, fish, anything. The ocean looked deceptively empty, a wide blue desert with nothing but shimmering waves stretching into infinity. Hours passed in relative silence. The sun grew stronger overhead, baking his salt-covered skin and cracking his lips. Elias cupped seawater, rinsed his mouth without swallowing, and spat. The dryness was unbearable, but he knew better than to drink what surrounded him. He had done that once in his early fishing days, only a mouthful, and it made him sick for 2 days. By midday, delirium crept back in. His head felt light, almost floating above his body, as if the consciousness inside him was slipping free. He shook himself repeatedly to stay alert, slapping his cheeks lightly. "You don't get to give up," he muttered under his breath. "Not yet." A faint shadow flickered beneath the surface. Elias blinked. Another shadow, then a ripple, then a glimmer of soft blue. A school of jellyfish drifted past, dozens of them, their translucent bells pulsating gently, trailing long ghost-like tendrils. They looked otherworldly, almost beautiful. A better man with a better life might have admired them. Elias saw only food. He reached cautiously over the edge of the raft. Jellyfish were a dangerous gamble. Some species could paralyze a limb with a touch, others carried stings powerful enough to kill. But these looked familiar. Pacific moon jellies. Painful, but edible if handled carefully. He plunged his hand quickly, scooping one of the smaller jellies into a piece of torn fabric he had salvaged from his shirt. The creature quivered weakly in the cloth. "Sorry, my friend," he whispered, knowing the apology meant nothing. He bit into the jelly. The taste was barely a taste at all. Watery, rubbery, cold, like chewing gel that refused to break apart. His throat spasmed in revolt, but he forced himself to swallow. Another bite. Another. It wasn't nourishment, it wasn't a meal, but it was something. He collected 2 more jellies, smaller ones, and repeated the ritual. Each swallow brought a sting of salt and a gag reflex, but eventually his stomach calmed its angry twisting for maybe an hour. Then the nausea hit. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. Elias clutched the raft's plank as his stomach heaved violently. He leaned over the edge and vomited. Everything he had forced down came right back up. His vision blurred, his head swam. His heartbeat grew irregular, pounding too quickly 1 second and too slowly the next. "Oh no," he rasped, recognizing the symptoms. He had eaten the wrong jellyfish, or maybe too much of it. His tongue felt thick. His fingertips tingled. A burning sensation spread through his throat and chest, drifting downward like a creeping poison. He squeezed his eyes shut, breathing rapidly through the pain. He had survived storms, predators, a night colder than death itself. But jellyfish poison, was this what would take him? He lay back on the raft, fighting the urge to panic. Panic meant faster breathing. Faster breathing meant faster spreading of whatever toxin now circulated in his blood. He closed his eyes and focused on staying absolutely still. Minutes crawled by like hours. The burning dulled. The tingling softened. The nausea slowly receded. It wasn't gone, not completely, but enough that he could think again. He opened his eyes. A gull circled overhead. Elias stared at it, confused. Birds rarely came this far from land, not unless there was something else floating nearby. He sat up slowly, ignoring the lingering dizziness, and followed the bird's flight. There, to the northeast, something bobbed up and down on the waves. A barrel? No, 2 barrels lashed together by a piece of rope. His heart kicked in his chest. Where there were barrels, there could be emergency supplies. He ignored the pain in his stomach, grabbed the plank, and began paddling with arms that felt like they barely belonged to him. Each stroke burned. Each motion felt like acid running through his muscles, but the barrels were not far, maybe 20 meters. 10. 5. He reached out, grabbing the rope with one trembling hand. He almost cried. The barrels were from a fishing boat. Maybe even from his own, he couldn't tell. But someone had built this makeshift float. Someone had tied something inside. He pulled the barrels closer, wedging them against the raft. Then he inspected them. Weathered dent marks, but intact. He worked at the rope with numb fingers, struggling for several minutes until it gave way. The barrels drifted slightly apart, revealing something shoved between them. A small waterproof case. His breath hitched. He grabbed it, forcing the latch open. Inside, a flare, a small first aid packet, and a sealed pouch of dried seaweed. Elias let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. It wasn't much, but to him it looked like a feast, like rescue, like hope. His hands shook as he tore the seaweed pouch open. The smell hit him immediately, earthy, salty, faintly briny, but nothing like the jellyfish that poisoned him. He devoured a handful greedily. The dried strands softened on his tongue, giving him the first real sense of nourishment in days. He ate slowly after that, forcing himself not to consume the whole pouch at once. His stomach, still fragile from the jellyfish toxin, felt tender but accepting. After finishing a small portion, Elias leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the sun warm his skin. For the first time in days, he felt something almost forgotten. Strength. Not much, barely a spark, but it was there. Hours later, as afternoon faded toward evening, Elias felt the ocean shift. Not violently, just enough for him to sense a change in the wind direction. The current moved subtly, nudging the raft southwest. He sat up. The waves were different now, less uniform, less open ocean expansive. There was land nearby. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. His pulse quickened. His breathing steadied. The faint dizziness in his mind was replaced by cautious anticipation. He might be saved soon, unless the sea had one last trial for him. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water, Elias squinted toward the horizon and froze. There was something moving in the distance. Not a boat, not land. Something long, dark, a fin. Then another. A pod of sharks. heading straight toward him. As the ninth sunrise bled pale light over the drifting debris field, Elias Romero lay curled beneath the torn canvas he had stretched over the shattered hull. His body had thinned into sharp edges, every bone visible through salt-burned skin. The taste of jellyfish still clung to his tongue like a chemical film. He no longer felt hunger as a physical ache. It had transformed into a hollow pulsing, a slow trembling running through his limbs. His mind drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes sharp as a blade, sometimes dissolving into scattered, feverish flashes. But that morning something anchored him suddenly, a sound he had not heard in 9 days, an irregular mechanical thrum cutting through the wind like a serrated whisper. Elias forced his swollen eyes open and listened harder. The sound rose and fell, a pattern that was too deliberate to be waves. His pulse quickened, his breath scraping against his throat. He crawled out from beneath the canvas and braced himself against the remains of the hull. The world spun, dotted with black flecks. But he stayed upright long enough to scan the horizon. The ocean lay still, except for the slow swell. Then, there it was, a faint speck slicing across the distant sky. A plane, a small one. Low-flying, moving in a sweeping pattern, his chest tightened so violently it hurt. Rescue planes never flew this low unless they were searching. His voice cracked as he tried to shout, producing only a hoarse rasp. Panic surged through him, a frantic cold blooming through his chest. He staggered back toward his raft of debris, ripping off a long strip of fabric he had sun-dried days earlier. With shaking hands, he tied it to a piece of broken oar and raised it like a flag. But the cloth hung limp. No wind, no motion, no signal. Elias looked around frantically until his eyes stopped on something half-submerged, an old plastic fuel container. An idea flashed, reckless but desperate. He pulled it free, opened it, and inhaled. Faint fumes still clung to the plastic, not enough to burn, but enough to smoke. He shoved the container into the center of his wreckage raft, piled dried seaweed around it, and struck the bottom of his broken knife hard against a warped metal plate, again and again. Sparks spat out erratically, but none caught. His muscles ached, but he continued striking, teeth clenched, praying silently that the smallest spark would land where it mattered. After countless attempts, a thin thread of smoke began to curl upward as the seaweed heated. Elias blew gently, coaxing life into the ember. The ember glowed red, then orange. A tiny flame flickered. He shielded it with his body like it was a newborn and fed it more dried seaweed. Slowly the smoke thickened, rising in a dark, unmistakable column. The plane was turning. Elias felt time stretch painfully as the aircraft banked, its shadow sweeping over the water. Then it straightened its course, directly toward him. His eyes filled, not with tears, but with the sting of salt and disbelief. He waved the makeshift flag with every ounce of strength left in him, though his arm felt like dead weight swinging from bone. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to his knees. But he kept waving, kept signaling, kept refusing to stop. Above him, the plane dipped its wings, once, then twice. A universal sign. They had seen him. Minutes later, a thunderous roar grew behind him. Elias turned his head weakly to see a rescue helicopter approaching, water whipping into spirals beneath its blades. The downdraft blasted the smoke apart and flattened the sea around him, but Elias barely felt the force. All he could process was that this nightmare might actually be ending. He slumped forward onto his hands as a rescue diver plunged into the sea. The swimmer reached him quickly, grabbing Elias under the arms. The diver's voice sounded distant, muffled, almost dreamlike. "Stay with me. You're safe now. We've got you." As the diver secured him into a rescue harness, Elias's gaze drifted over the ocean that had tried to claim him. He thought of the jellyfish he had swallowed painfully, the sea snails he had cracked open on splintered boards, the storms he had survived by sheer instinct, and the constant dread of drifting into oblivion. Everything he had endured blurred together into something unreal, as if it happened to someone else. When the winch lifted him from the water, his limbs dangled lifelessly, but his eyes stayed locked on the sea. The helicopter door slid open above him and hands pulled him inside. Warm blankets wrapped around his shaking body. A medic pressed an oxygen mask over his face while another checked his pulse. Their voices overlapped, analyzing numbers, calling out dehydration levels, blood pressure readings, and signs of exposure. But Elias barely heard them. All he felt was the shocking sensation of being sheltered again, of metal walls around him, of the hum of engines, of human presence. He had almost forgotten what safety felt like. A hand pressed against his shoulder, steadying him. He blinked upward at the face of the medic, who offered a reassuring nod. Elias tried to speak, but the words fractured. His throat was too dry, too strained. The medic leaned closer, understanding without needing to hear. "You're going to make it," he said calmly. "You did everything right. You kept yourself alive." Elias let the words settle into him like a slow-burning warmth. He had survived 9 days against an ocean that swallowed entire ships without remorse. He had eaten the creatures most people feared touching. He had clung to life with a stubbornness that defied reason. And now, as the coastline formed in the distance, he realized something he hadn't dared hope for in days. He was going home. As the helicopter streaked toward land, Elias's eyes drifted closed, not from weakness but from release. The terror, the hunger, the isolation, all of it loosened its grip. He surrendered to a deep, heavy sleep, trusting the world to hold him again. Below him, the ocean shimmered in the morning light, vast and indifferent. It had not beaten him. It had not claimed him. And though it would swallow countless souls in its endless life, Elias Romero, against all odds, against every rule of nature, was not one of them. In the days following his rescue, Elias Romero lay in a hospital bed, wrapped in layers of quiet. The kind of silence that felt earned after a battle no one else had seen. Nurses checked his vitals, doctors whispered about his electrolyte levels and the extent of his weight loss, but Elias heard almost none of it. His mind drifted, replaying the endless stretch of ocean, the hard lessons it forced him to learn, and the thin line that separates survival from surrender. He realized how quickly life can collapse, how a routine fishing trip can transform into a fight for existence. Yet he also understood that survival demands more than instinct. It requires humility, improvisation, and the courage to face the unthinkable. The jellyfish he swallowed, the sea snails he cracked with shaking hands, they were not symbols of desperation, but proof of the fierce will that had kept him alive. When Elias finally stood for the first time, gripping the bed rail for balance, he looked out the hospital window and saw the coastline stretching into the distance. The same ocean that nearly consumed him rolled peacefully against the shore, unaware of the war it had forced him to wage. He thought of the nights wrapped in cold darkness, listening to the groans of ruined wood and the hiss of waves, unsure if he would live to see the sunrise. He remembered the stinging tentacles, the metallic taste of seawater, the faint flicker of hope that arrived only when he forced himself to act despite the fear. And as he watched the horizon, he realized that survival was not the miracle, it was the mindset. The refusal to give in, the determination to fight even when the body falters, the belief that one more breath is always worth taking. He had been a fisherman all his life, but now he carried a deeper understanding of the sea. Its beauty, its brutality, and its indifference. Reporters eventually sought him out, eager to hear the details of his ordeal, but Elias spoke quietly and sparingly. He didn't embellish the story or turn it into spectacle. He simply said he did what anyone would try to do: stay alive. Yet beneath those simple words lived the truth of his experience, a truth only he would ever fully grasp. His survival was not just a story. It was a testament to endurance, to adaptation, to the raw and unfiltered will to continue even when the world shrinks to nothing but hunger and horizon. As he stepped outside for the first time, sunlight warming his skin, he breathed deeply and felt the fullness of life return. He had been lost at sea for 9 days, reduced to instinct and desperation. But he had emerged not broken, not diminished, but sharpened. Proof that even in the vast emptiness of the ocean, the human spirit can carve out its own path home.